Thanks so much for joining us today. Now, before we start talking about what task is ahead of you, I'm wondering how we got to here in the first place. You wrote a letter, right?
I wrote a letter. I had been hearing from several friends in the area about what's happening in the legislature. Part of the we've had a lot of conversations around the Me Too movement, and I felt like it was important to bring it to the attention of leadership, and so just drafted a pretty simple letter and invited the ladies of the House and the Senate if they would like to sign it, and we were kind of on a time frame, and so 14 ladies signed the letter, and I don't know that I would say that meant that there wasn't support from other ladies. And there were actually several of them that said, have you asked gentlemen to sign it as well? And that was kind of a conversation I had with a few other folks. And ultimately, I felt like it does impact women more than men, and I feel that there are a lot of very supportive legislators towards this effort, but that it was women that needed to have our voice heard in it. So we just left it at the ladies.
And from my vantage point, I was really glad to see the letter and to have the opportunity to sign. And I tell you that almost every woman in the body wanted to sign it, but it's over the interim, and many didn't have access to seeing their email. But I would say that this has been in the works for a long, long time, and I think it's an evolutionary time in our body as well as across the United States, if you think about it, in other legislatures, in that women are more and more prominent in the workplace, and that I just have to remind us that this is we're looking to stop harassment, not just sexual harassment, but harassment. So it's a need that has been evident for a while, and I'm just glad that it's come to fruition, that we're doing some work on it.
And I think that's an important distinction to make. We're not just talking about what we think of traditionally as sexual harassment, but there are also other ways that you can harass somebody, whether it's not taking them seriously or over not gender, but sexual orientation or race or anything like that. There are a lot of different dynamics at play here.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, they're all things that, whether you invite them to the meeting, how you address them when they're before a Senate or House committee. Do you call a woman by her first name and call the rest of the folks that are presenting by their title or last name? All of those things are a way of diminishing someone, and it gives them less access.
And in my experience, when people call women by their first name as opposed to their title, it's not necessarily conscious, or it's not meant consciously to put somebody down, but it's just what people do. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I actually have not had any issues about that, but I'm newer to the legislature and people aren't maybe as comfortable with me, and so I haven't had those kind of issues. But I can see for those folks who are more long-standing that it's easy to get too comfortable with them.
So now you two are co-chairing a working group that's still coming together. What are you tasked with?
Well, we're tasked with a tight timeline because both the speaker and the pro tem have said this is an urgent issue and they would like to have something resolved by the end of the session. But we're looking at policy and what's the best policy to put in place that makes for a respectful workplace environment, not just amongst the legislators and between the legislators, but amongst and between everyone who works in the building.
Not only that works, but comes to the building, because we really do have a higher calling, and that is to make this environment respectful to anybody that comes in our doors. And it's really important, and I just think that it's quite a charge. We were given a draft and a few little guidelines, and what we're to do is to create something that will be valuable and usable and practical that we can leverage throughout this building.
And we talk a lot about it's the people's house. And so the respect needs to be for the people and not just for one piece of the people, but for all people who come through the doors.
But there are challenges to that because the People's House doesn't have an HR department. We have different bosses. I have people I answer to at Idaho Public Television. You have the voters. I mean, House Speaker Scott Bedke isn't your boss.
And we've talked about that. I don't get a performance evaluation from the speaker or you from the pro tem. My performance evaluation comes from the voters in District 5, and yet The speaker makes committee assignments and sets the tone for the House side, as the pro tem and the lieutenant governor do for the Senate side. So it's kind of a messy business that we're going to be diving into, I think.
And so I really appreciate that it's a respectful workplace, because that really challenges you on a lot of fronts. It's respectful how you're viewed by your constituents, how people that don't know you from Adam, who walk in off the street. We have a responsibility, and if we can be respectful to one another, perhaps we'll be able to do the hard work of legislating better and be perceived better and be approached more readily. And for example, the lobbyists are invaluable to us. They bring us information, they take information away. I have been concerned, having been a woman in the workplace and in corporate America for a long, long time, about things that I've seen in that environment. And often women don't get access. And I'm really concerned that women or newbies or new kids on the block have the same access to legislators, because it's a value to me. It's a value to us. But if they are not given that access, we're missing an opportunity.
And that's an interesting thing you just said, because when I think about the history of governing worldwide, that women being in power, whether as elected officials or as employees or as the press, that's a relatively new phenomenon.
Absolutely.
But we've inherited all of these systems that have been set up by men that focus on social situations where men talk about policy over drinks and go out in social situations. We're expected to do that even though we didn't set up that system, but there are different dynamics there.
That's really interesting, because sometimes we're expected to do it and sometimes we're absolutely not invited, not included, and not expected to do it, but we still need to have the knowledge that comes from those informal conversations. Sometimes we're really disencouraged from participating, and it puts us at a one-down position.
So you're not just looking at policy, you're looking at a social change almost.
It's going to be, I don't know if it's a social change or a cultural change for the building, and just awareness, I think, sometimes is a really great first step. I witnessed it on the floor yesterday. A gentleman said something to one of the ladies, and she said, well, you know, that's probably not the best way to say that. And so I think we've already made some progress just simply by starting to have the conversation.
So policy-wise, what needs to happen?
There's so many things that need to happen. I mean, people of good intent do a lot of really stupid things. Mm-hmm. So your intent and your impact are not the same. So we need to first stop and think about what we're doing. And when you've walked through your life doing things a certain way for a long, long time, it becomes unconscious. So we have to start to become conscious of what we're doing. And we need to share that information. And if I view something from my colleague that makes me disquieted, I should go to her and tell her that. It's important that I participate. I don't have to be a victim. I don't have to be somebody that's been diminished. It's just, I'm going to tell you, like you just said. Mm-hmm. You could say that a little differently. So we all have a responsibility to hold each other accountable and to support each other too.
Yeah, I think probably as much as anything is to help women learn not to be afraid to say something, to speak out, to not be a victim, to choose that. And we talked a little bit about that before we started taping, and I struggle with that, being assertive. I've been taught to be nice, be really nice to everybody, and
to your detriment. Sometimes you're so nice you go home and cry all night. So one of the other things that I would hope that this would encourage would be our men partners to step up, because we do have partnerships with the men we work with. I want them to step up and step out, even ask the question that may be uncomfortable to them so we can give them some feedback. I'm looking for a more true partnership. When you look at this body, when I first came, there were many fewer women in the legislature. We're growing by leaps and bounds, so we're here to stay. So we need to create an environment that makes it good for all of us.
As you're putting together this group, which hasn't yet been finalized, you haven't had any formal conversations about it, how much interest have you had from men?
I've had a few. I've had, I think, 3 men come to me that said, I'd like to do it. Maybe some of them are quiet or don't know how the process is, so I don't want to say that that's indicative of the fact that they're not interested. But I have heard men say, oh, gee, can I hug you? Can I shake your hand? Can I? And I hope they're asking in jest. I hope.
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of men come and talk to me about it, but I think that there's uncertainty on if they're supposed to be included. Is this, there hasn't, there hasn't been a lot of talk about, this is really policy, we're setting policy for a respectful workplace, and we are all partners in this policy. And so I think that there's some uncertainty, you know, is this a women's issue? You know, women are part of that, and I think if there was a better understanding about really this is straight up policy that we're setting, that there might be a little bit more understanding by the gentlemen of the
We're gonna do
body.
our best to make that more clear.
Yeah.
It's about all of us.
Yeah. We're all new to this, kind of making it up as we go.
That's great. So what role do men play when we're talking about these kind of cultural and policy changes?
Well, I think they're an important voice in the conversation. That everybody's perspective is valuable. We can't. It's not fair to value one perspective over another in this. We need to value everybody's perspective.
We have to understand there's a power dynamic at play too. And when we talk about mainstream dominant culture in the United States, whether it's in the legislature or whether it's in the corporate America, it has been driven by a very powerful, very positive, that's why we're a world leader, by men. Women have played a role, but we don't know about that role pretty much. So I'm not demeaning men. What I'm saying is we want to walk alongside them and partner with them. So their responsibility is to hear us and we to hear them, and for us to collaborate to get the best possible outcome.
When you talk to people about the idea of power dynamics, what's their response? Because I guess I'm thinking in my experience when I talk about power dynamics, sometimes people get defensive, like, oh, well, I didn't mean to do that.
When you use words like power or privilege, people get very defensive. And quite frankly, every single one of us has some degree of privilege in a certain area. So we have to destigmatize that a little bit. Now, that's not our role as being activists or anything, but I just want people to be conscious of the impact of the pro tem or the speaker making a statement is a lot different than the new guy that just walked into the legislature for the first time making the same statement. I mean, the person that hears it gives it a lot more weight, spends time trying to decode it, spends time trying to say it, when half the time they're just saying something just off the top of their head. So we have to understand a power dynamic. We as legislators, when we go out into the community, just by virtue of representative, senator, you know, you don't want to walk in the grocery store looking bad or talking trash, because there's a certain amount of power that comes with it. So there's power dynamics for everybody, but I want to say that men in our society for the longest period of time had the epitome of power. Mm-hmm. So now we're just asking to share.
So even though this is a very policy-focused group, you still have a lot of cultural and historical baggage that sets the backdrop for that. And as you said, you have a very, very short time frame in which to figure this out. Are you confident that you can fix problems this session?
Well, I'm confident that we can have a policy that works well for Idaho and for the legislative body. Certainly, we can't fix what generations of
We're women, but we can't do it all.
Yeah. In 6 weeks.
Give us a little more time.
Yeah, maybe 7.
Well, depending on how these tax fights go, you might have 7.
Yeah, yeah. No, I've looked at policy that have come from other states, and I quite frankly, in December, I was at a leadership training in Colorado Springs and with a bunch of Western state legislators, and hearing the stories that are going on in Colorado and California. One of the stories I heard was of a senator. They had to take the door off of his office because he behaved so badly, and he still behaved badly. And then both he and the person he was harassing are on the ethics committee. So then what do you do? So I was like, oh, thank goodness I'm in Idaho. Yeah. Because, you know, it's just not quite as prevalent. It doesn't seem to me, and you know, to have that deep a level of problems.
And one of the things you ask about is what we're looking for. Transparency will be really an important piece, so that I as an individual will know what I can do if something happens to me. I as an individual will know what they can do if I have been misrepresented. How can we navigate these waters? So
you said something really interesting to me that makes me wonder about what path Idaho is going to take. You gave a really extreme example of something horrific that was happening, and Idaho has had similarly bad problems in the past. But a lot of what we're talking about right now isn't the worst forms of sexual harassment. It's a lot of gray area stuff, right? Not gray area, but there's a continuum. You know, it's not straight up patting people on the butt when they walk down the hall, but it is not respecting people, and it is borderline flirting with them, and maybe it's hugging them when they don't want to. Because our examples, our everyday examples, aren't as extreme, are you worried that people won't take it as seriously?
I think what's going to be really important is the strategy and the procedure that we put in place for reporting. And I think that that'll show how serious we're taking it. That's the question I'm most concerned about is the reporting, and for people to feel comfortable in their reporting and confident that it's going to be taken seriously.
So to be clear, in the draft policy that I saw, it set forward a clear path for reporting, and it talked about what wasn't acceptable, but it didn't say what happens next.
Yes.
It didn't say what the
We're gonna look at it
consequences
from
are.
the top of the document to the end of the document with input from all. And I think one of the things that's important is clarity. Clarity. We kind of had to start at a baseline level because we've worked in a corporate environment. We had language, we had nomenclature about what harassment is. I think with all the heightened conversation, people want to know what they can do to interrupt or to keep something from ever happening, to make their walk in the world a lot easier. So that's what we're trying to do. The baseline, and then we'll go up and up and up and up, and then maybe we can interrupt those behaviors that you've seen or read about in other areas. So I think that this body, including everyone that's here, not just legislators, want to get this right. And we want to do everything we can to put a roadmap to do that.
And really, I've done a lot of reading about this over the last couple of months. It's a very interesting topic, and one of the most important things is how leadership sets the tone. You know, we can do everything we want. We can write a ton of policies, but if leadership doesn't say, yes, we're going to take this seriously, we're not going to tolerate this, we're going to make sure that there's a procedure in place to stop bad behaviors, and we're going to hold people accountable, we could write 100 pages of policy and it wouldn't make any difference. So I feel very confident really that we have the right leadership that are concerned about this. I think they were working towards this before we even sent them the letter, that this was a conversation that they had started having. How are they going to address it? How are they going to make sure that Idaho takes this responsibly and does something responsible and effective towards resolving this? And it's setting the tone at the top, and that's true wherever you're at.
And the important thing is that the person that needs to report is not in jeopardy of a lot of pushback or fault. I mean, that's the thing.
Retribution.
The reason all this stuff is so secreted is because of the fear of reporting.
So as you're looking at potential consequences, there are a lot of hurdles because of who controls what power for those consequences. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's a little premature for us to say what that will look like, but I believe we're going to have to be in consultation with our leadership. We're looking at best practices from across the United States. We're looking even at corporate policies to see what might work. Because this is a unique body. Again, as my colleague suggested, I don't work for the pro tem, she doesn't work for the speaker, but the power dynamics are unique, and how will that be handled? That's
And
an
I think
opportunity.
all legislators across the nation are struggling with that, and we've started getting policies are trickling in from other states. I spoke to a gentleman yesterday who went to the training at New Mexico State, and so they're all struggling with what should this look like, how far does it go, so we don't have a best practices model to follow in this area, which is kind of unusual. I mean, if you're a large corporation, you can just call up 10 large corporations down the street and say, what's working for you guys? And we can't really do that because nobody's done it yet.
And
So-
legislatures across the nation are set up differently. So we can take best practices and try to leverage them, but we don't have a clear line on the best way to do it for us.
And we also have different power dynamics, as you decided, so that doesn't just decide who's the boss in charge of this one person, but is there going to be a difference if the chairman of a powerful committee or a member of leadership is accused of something versus a freshman lawmaker?
Yeah, and from what I've been seeing, most of them transition it in the policies and procedures into their ethics committees if you're a legislator, and then what does that mean? And I think for all legislatures, that's kind of a black hole that issues fall into. And I do think that there's resolution. I've never sat on an ethics committee. I do think they come to some resolution, but often we don't know what that resolution is. And so then there's the question, well, were they held accountable? And perhaps they were within a really stringent guidelines, but we don't know.
And questions have been raised to ask about, is this part of the ethics process? Is this whatever? And we are solely working on this policy. And whether it becomes part of the ethics process or whatever, I just want folks to be clear that's what we're working on.
And for those who might not be familiar with the Idaho legislature's ethics process, that's a pretty secretive process. You don't know if complaints have been made, and unless something drastic happens, you don't know what happens after that complaint has been investigated.
That's absolutely right. Like you said, a dark hole. We don't know what happens. And I understand protecting people's anonymity, but I also think that we have a responsibility to know what we can and cannot do, and that there will be ramifications if we do step outside the bounds of good decorum.
And one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, though, that I think is a concern, is what happens for those people who might be falsely accused of a violation of a respectful workplace policy, and how do you respect their privacy and don't, make it so public that they can't ever recover their good name if it was a false accusation. So those are equally weighty issues for us to be considering.
Either side of the coin is going to have some investigative time and some culmination from the investigation, but it's the and both, you're right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good luck with the task ahead of you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.